Welcome to the Ugly Bug Podcast, a production of the Ugly Bug Fly Shop and Crazy Rainbow Fly Fishing.
Welcome to the Ugly Bug Podcast. Today I sit down with Rob Barnowsky. We have a few laughs and discuss the differences between Wyoming fly fishing and Montana's fly fishing, kind of pros and cons to each. I think you'll really enjoy the episode. First, let's step away for a quick word from our sponsors.
The Ugly Bug Podcast is proudly sponsored by Wyoming. Wyoming-rooted fly fishing apparel and accessories challenging the traditional mold, designed by anglers for anglers.
What's up, Rob?
Oh, not much. How are you, Blake?
Good, man. Good.
Good.
Let's talk a little Montana versus Wyoming fly fishing opportunity and differences and whatever we get into.
Let's do it.
So you grew up central Montana-ish.
Southwest Montana. Yeah. So I grew up between Butte and Bozeman in a little gold mining town that prior to the rush to Bozeman was kind of a dying town. I mean, it's slowly declining, but because of the rush to Southwest Montana and Montana in general, I think really anything kind of west of Billings is kind of exploded, right? Yeah. So and you have spent, I mean, how many years up there? You were at Montana State. And
yeah, it was 8-ish.
8-ish years?
Yeah, not in college for all of them. But I was there.
Yeah, right.
8 years in Bozeman, yeah.
And fished a lot of that kind of, I think, fished similar waters at different times. And you've guided, all around Bozeman, then also the Bighorn, and fished around other parts of Montana. Missouri.
Guided the Missouri some,
Yeah.
Typical fishing guide, right?
Yeah.
Got work wherever I could get it.
Where there's people at.
Right.
Yeah.
Or Bozeman has not a weird season, but a more limited season, right? And the Missouri comes into shape, and Bighorn comes into shape a little earlier, a little longer season. So.
A little longer, yeah. The Bighorn's kind of in that weird little like banana belt almost over there, where you can get some warmer weather at the fringe season than some of the other tailwaters.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks don't realize like Bighorn technically starts on the Wyoming side, comes out of the Wind River Range, is really the Wind River until it leaves the Wind River Indian Reservation, and then at a specific designated spot when it leaves the reservation, it becomes a spot called Wedding of the Waters. It becomes the Bighorn at that point.
Right. So what do they call it? So right out of the dam, do they call it the Wind right out of the dam? Because it's not so it is still the Wind
till the end of the canyon.
Till the end of the canyon.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting.
100 yards above the Wedding of the Waters boat ramp is
right at the end of the reservation.
Technically where it changes its name.
But a lot of people ask, they wonder, well, so there's a change in name of river. That's weird midstream without some other river coming in. But there's no other river coming in there. I would get that question a lot. I'm sure you do too.
Yeah, it's totally native versus non-native naming. Right. Yeah. And it's an odd one too because it confuses a lot of people that a river flows north, and people think north is uphill when, much like the Platte, many rivers flow north before they take a directional turn east or west.
Well, I was going to say, I think the Missouri and Montana takes a north turn for a while too, right? I mean, as it comes, and Yellowstone takes a north turn. Yep. I mean, a lot of that stuff out of the mountainous region heads north for a bit before it takes a east or west turn.
Yeah. So north isn't always uphill. But if we kind of maybe break down, obviously Montana has a wide variety of different water types, different fisheries.
Right.
And one thing that, in my opinion, Wyoming can't really compete with, right? A place like Bozeman where you have, 8 different watersheds within an hour and a half.
Right next to it, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, you look at Bozeman, and I always say, like, you think of the big name waters you've heard of. I mean, I think everyone starts with the Madison, the Yellowstone. You've got the Missouri. You're not far from the Beaverhead, the Ruby, and you've got the Spring Creeks. I mean, there's just a incredible variety of fishing right there in Bozeman.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously still water stuff. There's all kinds of lakes and reservoirs and
and little creek. I mean, little stuff. Like you got the Boulder, you got the different. There's multiple boulder rivers in Montana, right? I mean, so there's multiple boulder rivers that hold trout. I mean, that I think when you look at Montana fishing, there's just a ton of rivers that are well known.
Yeah.
And just big rivers. I mean, you look at the size of the Madison, having the Madison, Yellowstone, and Missouri so close to each other. They're all big rivers, really.
Yeah. Very big.
Very big rivers.
Yeah.
I mean, comparable to what we have, compared to what we have in Wyoming. They're big rivers.
Yeah, for sure. So when you were growing up, you were primarily fishing what bodies of water?
So I was lucky enough that I had a great grandfather that homesteaded land in southwest Montana, and that land was on the Ruby River. And the ranch covered both sides of that river, right? And so, and for a while there, before I was born, and I forget when the law was passed on high water.
Sportsman's law. I should know that, but I don't.
I should know, but I don't. But for a while, it's essentially a secluded river, right?
Yeah.
When I was growing up, though, even still, it's fairly secluded because there's very limited access points to that part of the Ruby, kind of right out of Sheridan. So I grew up fishing that a fair amount. It's a smaller river, you're a couple hundred CFS, tailwater, and a great river to fish. And then the Jefferson, too, which for a long time, because of irrigation and irrigation demands and just not a lot of water coming, wasn't the best trout fishing river, but that's where I swam, that's where I fished, right? We didn't have a pool, so that's where I swam, that's where I fished. But that's a tailwater that is created by the Ruby and the Beaverhead coming together, confluence and created in Jefferson that ultimately flows down into the Missouri, right? So
yeah, and I think the Jefferson is one of those, might not have huge fish numbers, but often can produce some very solid fish, and many people are very fond of it, but not necessarily the most renowned fishery.
It's not the Missouri, right? So it's not where you want to be the 10th boat down and still think you're going to catch a bunch of fish, right? You want to make sure that you know what you're doing. It's a unique river because I think in a lot of ways unique to Montana. The traffic, probably because of the complexity and low numbers of trout, is probably less, right?
Yeah.
It's just not. It's not the fishery that the Missouri and some of those other rivers are in Montana.
Right. And so, as you grew up, did you start kind of branching out and jumping up to the Missouri some, or?
Yeah, we fished that some, and I still go back. So I still every summer, my family lives in southwest Montana. I still go back. And, in the last couple of years, I've gone and fished the Smith River. I was lucky enough to get a permit there a few years ago. The Yellowstone, the Missouri, the Beaverhead. The one that I haven't done in a number of years is the Madison. But really, it's a traffic issue for me. Everyone has their own preferences about how they fish. But for me, I just don't want to see a lot of people, so the Missouri was a stretch for me, right? And the Missouri's a big river. You're going to see people, but you're not going to be on people, maybe, right? So, so started to branch out there, and then later on in the Bighorn, I from probably 2005 to 2013, 2012, fished probably 2012, fished the Bighorn in Montana a fair amount too.
You saw it kind of go through a little cycle there of really good lower fish numbers. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily bad, right? It still had great fish numbers. It's still great fish,
but it wasn't.
Kind of got a rap that it died was on a dip.
Yeah, right. And so it went through a hard spell and fishing better again. It's a great river. And I've told you this. I'm biased. I love Wyoming waters.
Yeah.
If there was just a float for pace and enjoyment, the Bighorn in Montana, it's a beautiful river to float, not what you expect. It's a prairie river, right?
Yeah.
But you might see a bear out there. You're going to see some different things. But it's a big river that's comfortable to float, right? It's just easy going, and there's kind of always fishing somewhere, right? And there's always somewhere to fish.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about the Bighorn in Montana.
Yeah, and it's just a food factory. That thing is insane how quick fish can grow, and the sow bug scud population that's there. They grow quick, They can handle surprising amount of pressure and still be a phenomenal fishery.
It can, and it's funny to see, and I think that other rivers go through this too, is that when I was fishing it, the red San Juan worm was like the fly you'd run
all the time,
right? You'd always,
yeah.
And I think that probably has changed a little bit too from the last couple times I've been there, where it's not just you're going to run a red San Juan worm and some bigger scuds and
right.
or a lot of sow bug stuff, and so it's become, I think, a little more technical. Still, I think a really fun river. You and I have fished it in recent years together, and it's a beautiful river for a plains river. I mean, it's not a mountainous river,
right? Yeah, and some really veteran phenomenon. We have a buddy in common with it, Pete Chanefeld, that owns Bighorn Angler. Yeah. Awesome dude. Awesome operation.
Awesome operation. Great guys. And there's some. I always, I've talked about this. To guide the Bighorn takes a certain amount of dedication and knowledge, right? Because there are a lot of people that float it, and a lot of people that fish it, because there is a huge population center of Yellowstone County there. That's, I think at one point it was 1 out of every 7 people in Montana lived in Yellowstone County, right? So you have a huge population center within an hour and 15 minutes of really good fishing.
Yeah.
And so I think the guides that live there and make a living there, they know what they're doing. And Pete, certainly, great dude. Sam Mavrakis, one of my clients that I guide him here, and I'm trying to get him to guide me there. There's guys that are very skilled at what they do there.
Yeah, and I think it's a unique one there, primarily because they're guiding one specific fishery, much like guides here on the Platte.
Right.
They really get it dialed.
Right. They know exactly what they're doing because they guide.
Yeah.
Especially there, they're the same 3 to 13 miles every day.
Yeah.
Right. And then the Platte's kind of similar. It's not Bozeman where you might jump around a bit.
Right.
And have all these rivers all around you.
Yeah. And I think that's a unique, there's often, I think there's pros and cons to each of that as a guide, right? Like, I think one reason here in the Bighorn and maybe the Missouri that often a client feels like, maybe a non-expert client feels like they can come have a phenomenal day.
Right.
Part of that is the guide's got it so dialed in.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure when you're on a string of days on one stretch of water, when I was guiding, I think my last year I did my last big year, 189 days.
Yeah.
And how you make that work is I'd spend 2 weeks on one float, right?
Yep.
And at some point you'd be like, well, damn, there's a fish right here. Right. Get ready, right? I mean, You're the same way, right? Like, get ready. There's going to be a fish right here for you because you know kind of where they're feeding, where the food is, the weight and the depth. You get it super dialed, which is great for the clients. I think guides can get a little monotonous with that, right? It becomes like you're almost like a checker at Walmart. Like, here's another one, here's another.
Repeat.
It's just, there's some satisfaction in that, but that's why you got to change it once in a while too, right?
But much different than like when I was in Montana, where I might be in a 30-day window, might be on 22 different stretches or different fisheries, bodies of water. And so every day, even in a fishery like the Platte or the Bighorn, every day is still a bit of a puzzle.
Right.
We all love it the day that we can tie on at the lodge and it strokes fish all day. We never have to change. But that's usually not the norm, right? There's still putting pieces together. And when you're fishing 7 different bodies of water in 7 days, there's a period of time that your guide knowledge and skill plays a role there where you figure it out. Now, it might take a couple hours out of the morning to figure it out or piece it together or kind of figure out the routine, right?
So, no, I agree. I was laughing earlier today. I was talking to my wife and daughter, and they said, "What are you doing today?" And I said, "Well, I got to finish up work, and then I'm going to head over and do a podcast." And my wife said, "Well, what are you going to talk about?" And I said, "Well, fishing." And my daughter, who's 7, she goes, you don't know anything about fishing. You just know how to row a boat. But and I kind of had to get a chuckle because I said, you and I have both been in that situation. And any guide I imagine that's honest with themselves has been in that situation where it's like, well, damn, I know how to row the boat, but I don't know what these damn fish are eating right now, right? Like you're like, oh yeah, I've been on this river hundreds of times and I can't figure out what's going on regardless. And so I can't imagine the complexity of, like, when I've guided, I primarily guide two tailwaters, right? And it's the North Platte, Miracle Mile, Gray Reef, and down, or the Bighorn out of Thermopolis. And so there's a piece there of, like, I think there's got to be a lot of days when you're that guide trying to cover that much water of, well, I know how to row the boat. We'll get there safely, but damn, I don't know where the fish are or what they're eating today.
We're
right?
Gonna figure it out, and it's a fun little adrenaline rush. It's also a weird, in a way, you kind of get comfortable, right? Like a lot of times in Montana, obviously, I was a younger guide then. I wasn't as maybe competent in my skill set.
Right.
So if I had a window to go pre-fish a stretch and try to figure it out the day prior, a day off, or I could go fun fish it with someone else.
You got to do it.
Yeah, I would always try to take advantage of it, right? Just to try to have some sort of framework to work in within the next day.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think that's it, right? Well, let's shift a little to the Bighorn in Wyoming, though. I mean, so that's a piece. So we're primarily North Platte and the Bighorn. How do you think the Bighorn in Wyoming compares to what you see? Because you and I both fish both a lot.
Yeah.
What you're going to expect to see in both those rivers.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the first and foremost is the Wyoming side is a much smaller river channel fishery, right?
Average flows are what, less than half?
I would say 2,200 maybe. Probably more. Average flow would probably be more like 780, something goofy.
Right.
Right, but rarely will you see the Bighorn on the Wyoming side bigger than 3,500 to 4,000. At times you will.
Well, you and I both floated it when it was, close to 7 one time?
Yeah.
And you do the same float 3 times in a day?
Right.
Because you can't get under bridges?
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, on the Bighorn side, to be at $5,000 and plus is not uncommon at all. Yeah.
I'm sure I floated it one year on the Montana side, and I felt like it was fairly comfortable. I think it was 14 that year.
Yeah.
But there were people sinking boats, too.
Right. Oh, yeah, it gets some weird back eddies, especially there in front of the old drive-in run with the cars.
Yeah, you get some weird
suck hole.
You get some weird back. You get more back channels, certainly.
Yeah. But a much bigger river channel.
Much bigger river channel, yeah. Generally I think generally the Montana side still moves faster.
Yeah.
I think the decline is a lot faster on the Montana side as it moves. But they're both pretty calm rivers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, most of the time renting a boat as a non-rower isn't that dangerous on the Montana side.
Right. Although I think our buddy Pete Shanafelt lost a boat on the Montana side to a renter, did he not?
Oh, yeah, and when it gets over $10,000, you get some weird suck holes and mushroom heads that you can get in trouble really quick.
Well, and I remember seeing that boat, actually, that Pete lost. I was floating it around that time, and I thought, how in the hell did they end up in this situation? But you never know. When you're rowing a boat, a lot of things can happen.
Oh, yeah. The guy sunk one outside of Thermop last year in, like, a super slow spot. He just 3 guys my side all leaning the same way, and they dipped an edge. And
you got 2 guys netting a fish or something. Yeah. I mean,
it happens fast.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, when it does happen, it goes really, really quick.
Really quick, yeah.
My dumbass years ago sunk a boat on Story Ditch on the Upper Madison, which it's quite comical. It's really only about 3.5 feet deep, but I dropped my anchor on the uphill side, and then thought I was strong enough to just get my anchor free and wrapped it around my forearm and yanked like hell, and back of the boat sucked underwater level. It was sunk. I mean, we weren't in trouble.
You're fine.
My clients were still sitting in their seats, but we were touching bottom. The boat was sunk. It was funny. The lady was like, she goes, "Is the river in the boat?"
Is the river in the boat? Well,
yep, the river's in the boat.
So I remember reading a post by, we both know Blaine Gilliland.
Yeah.
And he said there's 2 types of guides: those that haven't sank a boat and those that haven't sank one yet.
Yeah.
And I thought, I really hope to kind of add a third category to that, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
you spend enough time though. Sooner or later,
it's going to happen.
Kick boat plugs out or something stupid.
I'll tell you, I got there's been a few times of floating Paradise Valley in Yellowstone where I thought, oh my God, I take my skiff on there, and I don't know the water like I do the Platte, where every turn. Like, I'm sure. I always laugh. Like, if I have to fall asleep, I don't count sheep. I guide fishing, right? Like on the Platte, like where I'm like, I think about every turn and like where you're going to fish it, and it's kind of monotonous. Like I'm sure, like you could probably do the same thing on a number of rivers where you just think about every turn, every piece of water, and it becomes somewhat normal. But when you go explore, it's a little different.
Yeah,
so.
for sure. But it's fun.
It's fun.
Right?
As long as everyone lives, you're good, right?
Adrenaline rush to it. A little uncertainty of like, I can't quite remember what's around the next corner.
Right.
Hopefully we're all good.
We're good, yeah.
Yeah. The one weird thing you get in a lot of Montana with those freestones, just the way the river will change year to year. Right?
It's going to wash trees in. It's going to move
last
banks.
year, what took place on the Yellowstone, I wasn't up there, but I can only imagine how that changed the demographics of how that fishery moves and flows, and new gravel bars and tree snags, and that was much more common than something like the Platte, where the kind of specific runs are usually always fishing. Those shells don't change much.
Well, what's the 10-year high on the Platte? I mean, 7,000?
7. That one year I think we got to like 8,200 for a couple of weeks, but
was that about 7-8 years ago?
Yeah.
Oh, killer fishing.
Oh, awesome. Yeah,
but still super safe.
Right.
I mean, I can imagine though that if you put a boat in and didn't know the river, you'd look at that first run out of the Great Reef Dam and be like, oh,
this is legit.
This is some real water.
Right.
Because right away you got wave trains.
Right. Yeah.
And then the rest of it pretty well flattens out.
Yeah.
So when you think of Thermopolis, Bighorn to Montana fishing, what do you think of?
I think there's less. To me, there's less fish on the Wyoming side as far as raw numbers.
Yeah.
Part of that smaller river, just the biomass can't exist because it's not the same size of fishery. But I think the Wyoming side is, generally less traffic.
Yep.
There's not as much fishable water on the Wyoming side, depending on flows, right?
Right, depending on flows, yeah.
And the runoff season on the Wyoming side can play a bigger role than on the Montana side.
Yeah.
Just because you got some tributary creeks that come out of that scory red rock sort of country that can really muddy the river up.
In recent years, that's an area. Their range has gotten a lot of water. I mean, they've gotten a lot of snow in the winter.
Yeah.
It's a very well packed,
right?
Range.
We've got another one this year. I think the Wind River, last I looked, was like 158.
Yeah. It's going to be a big
good
year again at some point.
And Boysen Reservoir on the Wyoming side just really isn't all that deep.
No.
It's a very big reservoir. It just doesn't have that much water storage.
It doesn't have capacity.
Yeah. So when you would think of, like, I guess the same question to you, the difference between Thermopolis side or Wyoming side of the Bighorn and the Montana side of the Bighorn, what are the vast differences that you...
I was thinking that I think now, and I've fished both kind of like pre what they call like a tough time in both rivers and post. I've fished both times. I think I love the variety of Wyoming. I love the size of Wyoming. I think the fish size in the Bighorn and Thermopolis, incredible fish size, right? I mean, and it's not unexpected that you're going to catch a brown, a rainbow, and a cutthroat. I mean, multiples, but it's still a primary rainbow river, but a really healthy brown trout river, and a really healthy cutthroat river, right? So as opposed to kind of our home river of the North Platte, which is 95% roughly rainbow cutbow.
Yep.
So when you go to Thermopolis, I think you get a nice combo of things. I think it's great. They have a lot of similarities, though, too, right? I mean, you're going to run similar bugs. You're going to run similar setups. The Wyoming side's more back rowable, more calm, easier to navigate, I think. And and less people.
Yeah.
That's really the big deal, right? For me is the first river I fished in Wyoming was the Bighorn in Thermopolis. And I loved it. I mean, I kept a boat, like a little personal pontoon in Wyoming for a couple of years. I'd come down and grab it and go float on my own and stop at, there used to be a bar partway down right by the little hardware store now. I used to stop there and I'd pay someone, I'd say, I'll give you a 6-pack. You just, you got to give me a ride at some point, right?
Shuttle me. Yeah.
Shuttle me. So I'd just go buy someone a 6-pack and then have them take me back up to my truck, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the Platte, though, a little bit. I mean, what's the river in Montana you compare the Platte to?
Well, I would probably say the Missouri.
Yeah.
Right? Missouri's a little bigger.
A little bigger, yep.
But I guess the reef stretch of the Missouri, I would compare the reef stretch closest to the Missouri.
Yeah, the first 8 miles of our river.
The mile, I would actually compare a little more to the Madison, right? Yeah. It's a little more turbulent, a little more pocket water.
Yep.
Super slippery, much like the Madison.
Super slippery, yeah.
Lots of round rock.
Yeah.
I think, obviously, the mile doesn't have the, raw traffic, boat numbers sort of thing that the Madison deals with. And it's not, you're talking 9 miles of river versus, the full Madison range. You've got a lot of.
What's the full Madison range? 100 miles. It's it's huge.
Be big. Yeah. And obviously, we touched on it slightly, but the Sportsman's Law, I think that was a mid 80s.
I think you're right.
Yeah. But 85 actually. So I just got bailed on that one. It says it happened in 85. The Sportsman's Law happened. Mid 80s that passed, but that's a huge definite difference between Wyoming and Montana. And in Wyoming, the landowner actually owns the bottom of the river,
right?
So, or basically whoever the land is deeded to, be it public property or private property, the landowner often in those circumstances owns the bottom. So there are spots that if you're floating through BLM land or whatever, you can anchor, but there's many spots if you're floating through private on both sides.
Yep.
The bottom of the river is privately held, and
you can't touch a rock even, really, right? I mean, like they technically own the
bottom, right?
And what do you see as the pros of that?
Well, I think one huge pro is traffic.
Yeah.
Right? It scares some people away. I think it allows us to have a healthier natural spawning scenario.
Yep.
Just because people can't pressure it.
They can't sit and wade fish a spawning bed all day, right?
Correct.
I mean, that's kind of the deal.
Correct. So I think that's why you see stuff here on the Platte that, the closest things the closest comparison I can really say is much like you see in Alaska, where you'll see 1,000 fish on a giant flat, all spawning in a relatively short window, right? A 2.5-week window. You've got just fish upon fish spawning. And so there's always a weird comparison. I mean, I think every angler is very pro public lands. It's awesome. We love it. But the private land aspect does, in my opinion, helps reduce some pressure. A company like us, where we happen to be connected to a bunch of that private land, is a big bonus. When we can wade fish spots that others can't. We have private boat ramps that people can't access. There's some benefits really from a business aspect. But from a health of a fishery aspect, I think there's some benefits that you just don't have the same amount of pressure. And, a lot of it you can back row, you can do whatever, but you got to work for it.
You got to work for it.
You just can't pull over and post up
on it,
I think one drastic difference for me is that Montana's just has much more spring creek opportunities, right?
Yeah, they do,
we just don't have those number of spring creeks in Wyoming.
No, we don't. I mean, I think that's the big difference when you look at the two, right, is that when you look at a map of Wyoming of major rivers that you can really put a boat in and float them. It's pretty limited, really.
It is.
I mean, there's not a lot that you're going to find on a Google search, right? Like probably what's going to come up is a lot of Jackson stuff. and
Platte,
then
the
Platte and the Green,
Upper Platte around Saratoga,
Upper Platte, and then Thermopolis. I mean, that's
Bighorn.
But you think about that, and you think about Bozeman, and within an hour or hour and a half, say, of Bozeman, of spots you can put a boat in and catch fish. It's a different scenario.
It is, yeah. I think there's pros and cons to each.
I do too, yeah.
I love to go fish Montana.
Yeah.
It has changed drastically for me, just raw number of people, even in places that I used to consider
pretty isolated.
Remote isn't really the case.
I've got a river in Montana that I won't even say the name of here, that you call a shop there and they won't even give you a report. So they'll say no, and there's no report on that, right? They don't want to mention it, but there's also I've also talked to guides that guide it, and they say, well, yeah, it's crowded. You got to be in there at 4 a.m, right? Because it's kind of places that you want to be.
Yeah,
the first or second boat down, because it's small or it's not huge trout numbers. And so I think you're right. I mean, it's amazing. I go back to my hometown now, and I look at pieces of water that they're putting boats in, and I think I didn't used to see this many drift boats around. I didn't used to see people fishing this piece of water. It's just it's really changed in the last, I think, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, it sure has. Well, let's call it. Good conversation. Appreciate it, bud.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Ugly Bug Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you have questions or feedback, reach out to us via email at info@uglybugpodcast.com or leave a comment on our social networks.